Alexi Burgess is the co-founder of Alcove Learning, a self-directed learning center for tweens and teens in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles. Alexi co-founded Alcove in January of 2020 and has seen enrollment increase since then as more families gravitate toward schooling alternatives, particularly those focused around self-directed learning. Alcove Learning is part of the Liberated Learners National Network of Self-Directed Learning Centers that was founded in 2013. And Alexi, prior to becoming an education entrepreneur, was a philosophy professor at Stanford and UCLA. Alexi Burgess, welcome to the Liberated podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Carrie.
It's so great to have you here. I was thrilled to be able to be in LA recently and visit Alcove Learning, meet you in person, and see what you're building there. It's such a dynamic location. You're offering so many incredible opportunities to local youth in a real kind of non-coercive, self-directed way. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your kind of academic background and your gradual discovery or gravitation toward self-directed learning kind of over the years.
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, I was an academic before starting Alcove. And for most of my life prior to that, I was a professional student. I sort of did everything by the book. And I guess I was teaching introductory classes in um, different schools in LA, for example, Claremont McKenna College. And I, I sort of started to feel disconnected from the kids in a certain way. So that is to say, um, I I was increasingly unsure why they were there and why I was there and what sort of dance we were doing together and what the whole point of it was. And because of the roles we were playing, student and professor, was very hard to sort of shake out of that and get uh, down to brass tacks and actually get to know these people. I mean, so, I always enjoyed having office hours and enjoyed cultivating relationships with students where you would see them in classes over the years. But it always felt to me like there was a pretty hard upper bound on what kind of impact you could have on the intellectual trajectory or the personal trajectory of an individual student. Um, and I guess I found that frustrating because, as I was saying before, so many of the kids I was encountering teaching intro to philosophy felt a little rudderless to me. They didn't really know why they were at college at all. And I don't say that to be judgmental. I think it's a failure of the system. I think one of my alcove kids recently described it as a people mover. So K-12 education is just a people mover. And when they said that, I recognized that in my own educational history. I was on a people mover, and I was proud to be on the people mover, and I was happy to be on the people mover. I was getting lots of positive reinforcement for being on the people mover, all the way up through becoming a professor myself. And then I was starting to have my own kids with my wife, and thinking for that reason hard again about what education ought to look like. I mean, I guess it's a professional liability, right? As a philosopher, I'm always going to ask why that way and not some other way. But I think one thing that clicked for me very early was that I didn't believe in a curriculum. So I think that's one thing that distinguishes Alcove and other unschools or self-directed learning centers from microschools in this larger movement, which is beautiful and diverse and super important. One thing that sort of distinguishes unschools is, and for me, it was just a failure to come up with any convincing reason why any given person had to know any given subject. So I just don't believe that everyone needs to know certain parts of mathematics. It seems to be possible to get along just fine for some people without knowing any parts of mathematics. And you can do sort of fanciful thought experiments, right, where you imagine they're world masters at every other possible subject, but they just have this one deficit. So how could you criticize them for that? How could you fault them for having that one oversight if they're doing all this other stuff? They could be living a beautiful life of the mind or making contributions to society in other ways. Anyway, I sort of going off the rails a little bit, but
well, and I know you also said, Alexi, to me earlier that this people mover, I love that image, sort of this conveyor belt of schooling, that it can also create sort of solidified silos for us if we think that we're good at certain things and not good at other things. And I know you said that that was something that you reflected upon as well. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Oh yeah, when we were talking a little bit earlier, I think when I was starting Alcove or first getting the idea together with my co-founders, it was the same time that I was having kids on my own and reflecting on whether I wanted them to go to school, and if so, what kind of school, and what my values were there. And it felt very important to me at the time, maybe more so than it does now, that um, they not define themselves narrowly in terms of certain talents or ability. I wanted them, given what we know now about growth versus fixed mindsets, I wanted them to be a little bit more amorphous than that, and have that be okay. So I had this vivid memory that I've often brought up. With my family and friends of being in second grade, so being probably 7 years old, right? Um, and thinking of myself as one of those kids who's really good at math. That's who I am. Um, my parents are both mathematicians, and my mom is a first generation immigrant, and she often said growing up that math saved her life. It got her out of poverty in Greece and over to the US, where she was able to have a new life for herself. And as often happens with first generation immigrants, they see that same apparatus as a way for their own children to succeed and thrive in this new land. So it makes sense to me in hindsight that I would have defined myself in that way, but I I I, I don't think that early narrow definition ultimately did me more good than harm, and so I wanted to try to mitigate that risk with my own kids. But it's a challenge, as you know, it's a challenge to um, not give those subtle positive reinforcements that get kids to think of themselves as having calcified talents. But yeah, so that ties in nicely, actually, the idea that there is no set curriculum, right? You can pursue your strengths at Alcove, you can pursue your weaknesses or growth areas, you can do whatever it is that you feel like doing. And that idea, once it clicked for me, that there didn't have to be a curriculum, you could start a school or a micro school or an unschool without a plan for what you were going to be teaching these kids. Once that clicked for me, that felt liberating and beautiful and scary too. Like, oh my God, really? We're going to make it up as we go along every semester? How? But and it's very, very difficult. But I think education as improv is a very special subsector of the educational space, and it's immensely gratifying for people who enjoy it.
I love that, education as improv. So I do want to hear more about how you discovered Liberated Learners and decided to affiliate with them for Alcove. But before that, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of the experiences that you had that contributed to your belief that education could look different from kind of a standardized conventional system. And I know you talked about an experience you had as an undergrad at Harvard with a club there that you were involved with, as well as tutoring later in adulthood. Maybe share both of those stories.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. I guess the first of them was in connection with this society. I guess that sounds very fancy, doesn't it? The Signet Society for the Arts and Letters. It's a smallish yellow house, I think, not too far from Harvard Square. And I discovered it in my sophomore year when a friend of mine invited me to apply for membership, and it ended up being a very important part of my 4 year experience there. So, one of the main functions of the space was just to provide lunch to kids who were working in the arts and letters, rather than going to a cafeteria. And so it was a little bit of a social venue in the middle of the day, but you could hang out there whenever you wanted. And there were also special events, of course, poetry readings and dinners and things with guest speakers who came to the university. But what I found most valuable about it was just having a place to be in the middle of the day, whenever you wanted to go there, when people who you were sort of friendly with, it wasn't a terribly large or small organization, would waft in and just share, and you could choose to engage or disengage, but it was a place to be where you knew there was a possibility of stimulation, as opposed to being in a library or being at home or being in a classroom, which provided its own kind of stimulation. So I prior to discovering the Signet, it didn't occur to me that that kind of space was possible. And it is deeply relevant to what we're trying to create at Alcove, insofar as Alcove has grown. My main partner, Lonnie, and I have realized that its fundamental function isn't really to be a school or even an unschool or an educational institution. Its primary function is to provide a space for kids to feel safe, and where they might have a realistic shot of achieving some kind of belonging. And I imagine, as I learn more about the larger microschool movement, I imagine that's one of the chief functions of shrinking education down to size, where you have something that more closely resembles a community rather than a horde. um, so anyway, yeah, that's the Signet story. And then the other piece was, oh gosh, you invited me to speak
The
to.
tutoring and
Oh
writing
yeah,
help that you gave later. Yeah.
I don't know if your listeners know about this, but there's this lovely national organization called 826 that the novelist Dave Eggers started a long time ago, and it has a couple of outposts in Los Angeles. And so when I was on sabbatical from Stanford one year, I started volunteering there as an after-school tutor. And it's free to the families who join it. It's the one that I went to is in Echo Park, which is, I guess the families who were using it in the public school system were primarily Latino, Latina, Hispanic. And at first, I thought I was just sort of helping with math homework or writing homework, or because it's a Dave Eggers organization, one of the things they add is um, uh, sort of exercises geared toward getting kids to engage with creative writing. So I thought I was just sort of facilitating the basic programming, but it dawned on me over that year that the real value I was adding and the real value that I was getting, actually, as a volunteer contributor to the organization, had much more to do with the relationship that was developing between me and these kids. And I guess that ties back to what I was talking about earlier about office hours in college, right? And trying to get to know kids in that setting. Um, it was just remarkable how much they craved having an adult who was not their parent taking an interest in their existence. Not necessarily anything special about them or what they were doing or thinking about, but just being there and seeing them and caring and asking some questions. Are you really into, I see you're drawing that car. Are you really into like race cars? Like, tell me about that. It was all the stuff that was happening in between the math problems and in between the writing exercises that I gradually realized was why we were there, or why I was there, and why I think the kids actually ended up coming back. And I don't think I was, particularly talented tutor or mentor. I think a lot of the grown-ups were doing the same thing, whether they realized it or not, showing up for kids and developing what I think psychologists call a secure attachment of sorts. And later in life, when I started poking around the alternative education literature and started reading some of the science in particular, I realized that one of the difficulties with our current K-12 education system is that so many children don't have a secure attachment to any adult in their learning environment. So yeah, just being a grown up who sees them and and values them as a person, which is another big mantra that I keep coming back to as I do this work. I think one of the guiding pillars of Alcove is that we see kids as human beings, as people. So that's sort of anti-adultist and more radical than maybe it sounds.
For sure. So let's now talk about how you discovered Liberated Learners and created Alcove. You had, by your own admission, a very kind of traditional, conventional educational experience, and then, of course, taught in academia in that traditional setting, but along the way had these formative opportunities that sort of opened your eyes to maybe what you saw as possible for teaching and learning. But what happened that really prompted you to open Alcove? How did you discover this world of alternative education and liberated learners specifically?
Yeah. It was a couple things. I mean, there was a cool organization just down the street from me called Urban Homeschoolers, which is, I think it's, well, yeah, it functioned as sort of a vendor to charter schools providing a la carte classes. And I got curious about that for my own kids, and I started poking the administration there to see if I could get involved. But at the same time, um, I, by chance, bought a copy of Creative Schools and started reading it. And in some early chapter, they mentioned North Star, which is the first center in the Liberated Learners Network. I think originally it was called Pathfinder or something. It opened in 1996. Ken Danford started it with a co-founder or two outside Amherst, Massachusetts. Obviously, you know it well. And I just Googled it, and everything about it felt right. I guess the core thing that felt right was that, in addition to there being no fixed curriculum, which I had sort of come to on my own, it was completely non-coercive. So they just don't believe in making kids do things that they don't want to do, and that felt profoundly right to me. So I wrote Ken an email, and he wrote me right back, which was the quickest response I had gotten to anything in a while. As you know, academia, for example, moves quite slowly. So I was impressed about this response time. And then I think he offered to get on a call with me. And anyway, maybe I started talking to Joel at the Princeton Learning Cooperative, another center in the network. And yeah, so it was that first phone call with Ken, and then I happened to be home on the East Coast for winter break, and I was visiting my family back home in Princeton, and they had this center in the town where I grew up. I thought I should go visit, and I met Joel, and I asked him the first 50 dumb questions that I had, and at the end of the conversation, I was still interested. And I actually thought, I don't know if I shared this story with you before, Carrie, but my sister is 5 years younger than me, and growing up, she did not have a smooth time going through the public school system in the way that I did in Princeton, New Jersey, and for various reasons that I don't need to go into. It's her story to tell, not mine. For various reasons, it clicked for me that if this place had existed 10, 15, 20 years earlier, and she had been able to go, she would have had less trauma as a child. And sometimes in the early days, I would get discouraged by the scale of this whole thing. I thought, what can one little micro school do? But then when you meet individual kids and you hear about individual stories, and you realize there's actually potential here to save a life. And I don't mean that hyperbolically, like lives can be saved by showing up and caring for kids in very basic, very simple human ways. Once you realize that, the concerns about scale just sort of, for me, they just sort of evaporate. So anyway, the trajectory involved talking to these people who were happy to talk to me and excited about the work they were doing. And I think I'm proud of myself for taking a leap of faith on an idea that wasn't mine. I used to really fetishize being the one to come up with the idea. So I was proud of myself that I could see the manifest value in someone else's idea and try to emulate it. And also too, I'm very grateful to Ken and Joel and everyone who's come before in this work for just planting a flag and showing that this is possible. Because if you just read this if this was just a thought experiment or a mental exercise, yeah, maybe you wouldn't be able to poke a fatal hole in it, but you wouldn't have the courage necessarily to say, okay, let's make it real. But they've made it real, and part of the value of the work that they do and that everyone in this movement does is saying, hey, this is not impossible. We can do this. And I'm forever grateful for that example, because otherwise we wouldn't have gotten this started. And doing Alcove together with Lonnie and with all of my colleagues and with all the kids has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life so far.
Oh, it's so great. I just want to back up a little bit. You mentioned the book Creative Schools that was written by Ken Robinson, where you discovered the organization North Star, which was founded by Ken Danford, as you mentioned, in 1996 in Western Massachusetts. Ken has been on the podcast. He then went on to co-found Liberated Learners with Joel Hammond in 2013. And now there is this sort of national or global network, really, of Liberated Learners, self-directed learning centers, specifically for tweens and teens. So great that you kind of gravitated toward that was the model that you wanted to adopt in Los Angeles. And you opened in January 2020, right before massive education disruption. But you were able to weather that storm and, in fact, grow your enrollment to the point where now you have, I believe you mentioned, about 30 students. You're at capacity in your current location. Now that things are sort of relatively back to normal and you're sort of where you thought you would be maybe in January 2020, tell us about what the structure looks like. So all of your students are legally considered homeschoolers, but they're able to access Alcove in a variety of different ways. Maybe you could share what a typical week is like.
Sure, yeah. So it is possible to engage in Alcove and not be a homeschooler, I should say, insofar as some of our members still participate in online charters. We're not vendors for online charters, but that's sort of our loss, because we have a pay what you can tuition model, which means families can just contribute what they can afford to, and it doesn't have to come out of the money they're given from their charter. Anyway, that's a little bit of inside baseball. Uh, uh, Kids participate in all sorts of ways. There's no mandatory attendance. There's an open campus. So usually when kids show up in the morning, they tend to stay for the rest of the day. But we have members who come 1 day a week or 2 days a week or all 4 days a week that we're open and participate on online activities on the day that we're not. Um, the rhythm we've gotten ourselves into, and it is funny to think about how it's what we were sort of hoping we would start with in 2020, is one in which we're offering a mixture of mostly one-on-one mentoring conversations, classes inspired by member interests. So those interests are expressed by the members in the mentoring conversations, but also in our weekly house meeting when we try to take a sort of straw poll of how widespread the interest in music production or theater happens to be that semester. And then some things that are coming online more recently that I'm excited about and that wouldn't have necessarily been possible in our first year are classes led pretty much exclusively by the membership themselves. So we call them clubs. Maybe we shouldn't call them that. Maybe that's a little infantilizing or creating a hierarchy. But we've got a movie mayhem or movie appreciation thing that's happening. We've got a debate club. We've got a photography club. And those are just high value things that kids look forward to every week, that are on the calendar, that are just autonomously run by the membership with very little oversight and as much support as the kids want, so they can come to us with a budget request if they need to get supplies for something, for photography, for example. And the other thing that's coming online is a really robust use of LA's fabulous community college system. So we have more and more older teens figuring out, with our help, but also with parents' help, how to enroll and how to take classes that they're interested in for credit, how to meet with advisors to try to design a curriculum that's going to allow them to graduate from community college and maybe transfer to a 4-year school after a certain number of years. So that's great. And I don't know what else is happening in the space. We have a theater production that's rehearsing in the afternoons. We hope to rent the Black Box down the street from us. there's no typical day for a typical student. And one of the things I had to learn, Lonnie and I both learned, I think Lonnie was a little quicker on the uptake than I was, is that the best recipe for success in this work is going back to the education as improv idea, to check all your expectations for how the day is going to go at the door, because they're only going to be sources of frustration for you. You have to be so light on your feet and so open to let the conversation go where it wants to go, which is tough if there's a pre-established curriculum that you feel compelled to deliver. It's hard to sort of simulate that looseness or that naturalness or that flexibility in that kind of more structured environment. And coming from that more structured environment, it's hard for me to remember to offer that to the kids. But I've gotten better as time has gone on.
And what is attracting families to Alcove? Are these
I have no
students?
idea. I wish someone would tell me.
Are they students who've been homeschooled? Are they students who've been in a conventional school and are looking for an alternative? I guess, what are you hearing as some of the motivations?
Yeah, it runs the gamut. So in the beginning, we had very few unschooling families, and this year we have more and more families who are pre-established unschoolers, maybe because of the pandemic. Um, in the beginning, we had more kids who weren't thriving in a traditional setting because of mental health stuff, and we still do. We continue to, and I think that's a really important piece of the work that we do, even though we don't have any trained psychologists on staff. We're grown-ups who care about kids and have plenty of positive and negative mental health experiences ourselves, and want to be there for young people as they navigate whatever it is they're going through. Um, and some kids are just like, they were bored at school. They were just racing ahead, and they just wanted to focus on the few areas that they were passionate about. Um, yeah, it's really hard to come up with sort of a standard description of a family who's interested in alcove. I mean, there must be something they have in common, because this is a very brave thing to do. Even now, even with all the progress we've made in the movement, I think there's still a lot of fear that families face. And I think we sort of joke sometimes with parents that once they're on board and once they've joined, um, the kids the kids are into it pretty quickly, and the parents require a lot of follow-up handholding and coaching and deschooling, which I've tried to provide behind the scenes. It's Yeah. So even though we're working with a group of parents who have selected this for their children, and thereby demonstrated a pretty high degree of bravery, um, there's still this fear that they're dealing with, that they're working through, and part of my job, I see, is to try to help them with that. And it's easier for me because they're not my kids, and I understand the fear as a parent of going your own way and bucking the system. And yeah, I think fundamentally, this year I look around the space and I see children who are happy. And
Mm.
I see there were a lot of kids who, when they joined us, were just, you would not pick them out of the crowd and say, "Hey, that's a happy kid." they they feel okay in who they are and what's going on. So yeah, I think families find us because their kids aren't thriving, and I think thriving fundamentally means they're not happy. So first and foremost, beyond algebra or quantum mechanics or whatever it is that we're trying to teach in our classes, um, what we care about, Lonnie and I, is that the kids are getting happier, and I think we're seeing that. And I can't tell you how heartening and powerful that is to see and feel. Because you have your doubts when you're doing something radical. You have your moments where you lose faith, but when you just see without a doubt that these children are better, they're just healthier. They're smiling and laughing and talking and sharing. It's just a no-brainer. It's like, duh, of course, like this first, then we'll worry about everything else.
And do you think that's sort of the secret to your success now, where you're at capacity kind of busting at the seams in your current location? Do you think it's that you're essentially, quote unquote, selling happiness and word is getting around
Yeah,
and
I don't
families
I
are
don't
hearing
know.
that, right?
Maybe. I mean, I think, yeah, but I think lots of alternative education centers have kids who feel better. I don't think there's anything particularly special about Alcove. I think we got lucky insofar as I think Lonnie and I and other staff members, now we're selecting for this actually, sort of self-consciously, have recognized about ourselves that for whatever psychological reason, we don't condescend to kids. I guess this also is sort of similar to seeing them as people,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the kids have fed that back to us when we've had teachers in the space, when they've pushed back against various instructors or inviting them to return. Um, they've often talked about feeling sort of talked down to or spoken to as a student or something like that. And I think it's just sort of a quirk, a fortuitous psychological quirk of mine and Lonnie's, that we didn't build into Alcove, but I think has served us well. Is just that we don't we're just hanging out with some peers. They're just some peers who have lived less long than we have, and we don't think we're better or wiser or smarter, or anything. If anything, I look to the kids for unexpected wisdom and fresh eyes on social problems and other stuff. So yeah, and Liberated Learners does counsel. I think maybe I don't know if we're supposed to say that. It does counsel that we not try to hire career educators because it can be hard to break out of those patterns. But I
B-school,
think
yeah.
maybe having been in higher education as opposed to the K-12 system allowed me to have a more equitable relationship with the students. I remember when I first showed up at Stanford, I was hanging out mostly with the graduate students, not my colleagues, because there was a big age gap, and I was closer in age to the students. So I've always felt myself aligned with young people. I'm the sort of weird person at the party when there are kids who wants to hang out with the kids and finds the grown-ups more boring.
Yeah. So you mentioned, Alexi, that you have a pay what you can model. Affordability is a huge priority for you at Alcove. You intentionally located Alcove in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of LA, which tends to be a more lower income area. Tell us how that works financially for you as a founder.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So it seemed really important to me and Lonnie and our other co-founder, Michelle, who's not at Alcove currently, to have a pay what you can model. We've flirted with other versions of it, and different LL centers use index tuition or like a tier system. And I think there are lots of different ways to do it. But what I like about our system is that we we just don't even interview the parents about it. We just sort of put ourselves out there as trusting them, and hoping that elicits trust in return, because trust is obviously a crucial ingredient in community building. So yeah, I'm sure we're bringing in less than we could have otherwise, but I don't know how much less, to be honest. I think we're doing okay. For a long time, until this year, actually, I didn't really draw any kind of salary myself. I've been privileged enough in my marriage to be able to take a few years where I'm just trying to build something. Um, so that was an important ingredient, and I know that lots of people who are trying to start alternative spaces in education or in other sectors of our communal lives don't have that privilege. So I'm keenly aware of that. But um, uh, the overhead is low, right? So we don't have a fleet of dedicated teachers. We do pay now an hourly wage, $40 an hour, for people who are slotting in once a week, which is better than it used to be, and I think it wants to get higher still. But we just have our main expenses are rent and salary for me and Lonnie, and we have two part-time people who also make the same rate that we do. And I should say, Lonnie and I also, when you sort of factor out the salary, do the math, it is roughly $40 an hour as well. Yeah, it's not a lot of money. You don't make a lot of money in education, period, almost all of the time, which is unfortunate and sad, and shouldn't be that way, right? They should Educators ought to be some of the most highly paid humans in the world, but our society hasn't organized itself in that way yet. But that means you tend to end up working with people who are pretty passionate and about what they do and enjoy the work and get energized by the kids. Um, yeah, it was important to us that Alcove not be a white liberal space, and it could have very easily been a white liberal space with me at the helm. And Lonnie and I are co-partners, but I should say Lonnie's, gosh, almost 20 years younger than me. He's a student I had at UCLA when I was teaching there in a couple of classes, and we just sort of hit it off. So just in virtue of my gray hair, I think sometimes people see me as the de facto big potato or whatever it is. But we are running the ship together. And gosh, where was I going with that?
I'd love to hear, Alexi, like, so what is the kind of average tuition that folks are paying? Some people are paying nothing.
Yeah, some people are
paying
paying nothing.
Yeah.
Full tuition is $1,600 a month, which is sort of arbitrary. The average is probably around 500 or 600 right now, I would say. But yeah, some people pay 100, some people pay 200 or 300, some people pay 800 or 1,300. It's really all over the spectrum. Yeah, I got that idea a while back because I read this article about a coffee shop on the west side of LA that just decided to get rid of prices. And I was like, really? You could do that? And so sometimes people would just leave a $20 bill for a $2 cup of coffee because they knew someone else needed it, or they knew they wouldn't have change some other time. And I just felt like, all right, well, let's try that. Why couldn't that work in this context? Why couldn't that very idea be the thing around which community coalesced? That leap of faith, right? And so now, I mean, this year, our demographics are finally starting to more closely resemble the demographics of Los Angeles at large, which is really heartening to see. And we had our first three members from Boyle Heights itself join, and we're getting more visibility in the community and trying to work on partnerships with arts organizations and other education spaces that are nearby. So yeah, it's a very eclectic and diverse group of kids, neurologically and racially and socioeconomically, and it's kind of amazing that you can have that happen without a huge amount of effort. So you might have thought it would take lots of consultants and an inside track on feeders organizations that identified likely applicants. But our approach is, I mean, we've always been mindful of race and social justice and economics, but we haven't had the resources to really throw a lot of energy at the problem of creating a community that reflects the diversity of Los Angeles. So maybe we've just gotten lucky, or maybe this pay what you can model is more powerful than it looks at first glance.
So, Alexi, I'd love to begin to wrap up by asking you to think at the kind of micro level and macro level about the future, not only what you see the future looking like at Alcove in terms of what do you do with the fact that you're at capacity and there's more demand than you can meet at the moment. And then at the macro level, where do you see alternative education and especially these self-directed learning models going over, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little bit embarrassed to end on that question because you obviously know much more about this than I do. I was joking with you the other day that I feel like I'm just poking my head up finally after 4 years and looking around at what everyone else is doing. So I only started using the word microschool like a couple of weeks ago. I think it's beautiful what's happening. I think I'm confident in saying that when you zoom all the way out, we're seeing a large-scale reorientation away from a top-down federal organization of schooling in the country to something much more bottom-up. That was expedited by COVID, that was expedited by the failures of No Child Left Behind. And there's a lot of anxiety in society about it. I think I just saw you posting about that John Oliver episode about fear of homeschooling and how we need to regulate and ensure, quality standards. And I just think the top-down approach is not right. It is not right to think that the way to champion equity is to insist on universal standards that each and every child in every situation ought to aspire to. That's wrong. That's not the way to educate people. Um, and I don't know that this movement is going to last. I don't know if it's a fad. I don't know if it's going to make it another 5 years, but it deserves to, because we're seeing ways of recovering joy around learning, and honestly, more importantly, just joy around being in young people. And it's just night and day. I mean, the sorts of outcomes that we're seeing at Alcove, I've never heard of anything like it in a traditional school setting. And it's not because we're awesome; it's because we're getting out of the way and letting them be, and just trying to help and facilitate rather than dictate and demand and expect. And teach, I mean, teachers know that teachers don't want to be in that position either, right? It doesn't feel good. It's not what they signed up for, to be taskmasters and disciplinarians. But we're stuck in this system. It's collapsing. It's a little sad that it's collapsing, right? Because it's collapsing in part because of right-wing attacks on the system over generations. And if it had more resources all those years, it might have been able to grow into something beautiful, but it didn't. It was under-resourced for years, and now it's not sustainable. We need something better. The kids need something better urgently. And so I'm not ashamed anymore to be offering an alternative to the public system. I think we need micro schools. We need community. I think just biologically, it's so much deeper than education. It's about being a well human.
And at the micro level, then, Alexi, where do you see your community going in terms of expansion and meeting this excess capacity that you
Yeah,
have?
well, that's the sort of paradox. I think we're committed to not getting too big, because when you get too big, it stops feeling like a community. It starts feeling like a cafeteria. It starts feeling like the commons. So I think North Star has sometimes had 40 or 50 or 60 members. I could see that. I could see that happening. They're refurbishing the house next door to us in Boyle Heights, so maybe we'll be able to add it to our rent at some point and expand and have an upper campus. um, but I think it wants to be bounded. It wants to be limited. You could always start another center, but I'm more interested in running Alcove. Personally, right now, I'm more interested in running Alcove as best as I can to serve as the kind of example that Ken's and Joel's centers served for me. I think there's real value in, even though it's small, because it has to be, because it needs to be a community, of doing it as well as you can and showing that that's possible to other people. And now it's actually been lovely to start to poke my head up again a little bit and notice the other schools nearby, to notice the larger micro school movement beyond the unschooling movement, and see all these people who are like, have these huge smiles on their faces because they get to do this work with kids. It's so awesome to see educators being happy again.
Mm.
uh,
Yeah, it's so empowering for both learners and educators, right? And that being able to cultivate that joy is really special. So, Alexi, what is the best way for my listeners or viewers to learn more about Alcove Learning and follow your work?
Yeah, you can check out alcovelearning.org. So don't go to .com. It's some sort of medical supply company, weirdly. And there'll be a link at the bottom to Liberated Learners, so you can see where there are other unschooling centers in the country and in Canada and elsewhere. And there are ways to sort of get involved and think about starting your own thing. Or if you're in the LA area and you're curious, you're welcome to just stop on by. Give me a heads up the night before, maybe.
That's wonderful. Well, Alexi Burgess, best wishes to you on
Thank you.
building Alcove Learning, and thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thanks so much for your time, Carrie, and all the work that you do in this community.